So we just finished looking at marine biomes, and now we are going to move to freshwater biomes. Freshwater biomes are divided up into the standing freshwater biomes, which include ponds and lakes, and then the running freshwater biomes, which are the streams and rivers. We'll start with ponds and lakes first. And the distinction between ponds and lakes is that ponds are smaller and shallower, meaning that sunlight can penetrate all the way to the bottom. Whereas in lakes, at least some of the water is too deep for light to penetrate. And you probably remember that in the ocean, the availability of sunlight was a significant determinant of what the food chain looks like in a marine biome. So, likewise, in lakes, there are also distinct biomes based on sunlight availability. Lakes are divided up into the littoral zone, the limnetic zone, the profundal zone, and the benthic zone. In the littoral zone, pardon me, which you may have realized shares its name with a zone in the ocean that is similarly positioned, we're talking about the water that is nearest to the shore. This means that the water is shallow enough for sunlight to penetrate, which supports the growth of producers like phytoplankton and aquatic plants, and those producers support a robust food chain of consumers that depend on them. So you can imagine this is a space that has a high level of biodiversity. The next zone is called the limnetic zone, and this encompasses the top layer of water that is not directly adjacent to the shore, downward in the depth where sunlight can penetrate, which remember is 200 meters for the photic zone. So, because sunlight is available in this zone, there are producers here, primarily phytoplankton that are suspended in the water, which then support the zooplankton and nectin consumers. However, because the zone is not directly adjacent to the shore and does not have aquatic plants present and other benefits of being land adjacent, there is lower biodiversity here than in the littoral zone. The third zone is the profundal zone. And this zone is directly below the limnetic zone. This describes the open water areas of the lake where sunlight cannot penetrate. Consequently, there are no producers in this area, just consumers who, like we saw in the lower zones of the ocean, feed on material that drifts downward on prey on their neighbors in the profundal zone. Because of the lack of consumers to support the food chain, this zone has an even lower biodiversity. And then finally, that brings us to the benthic zone, the very bottom of the lake, which again shares its name with the marine biome of this space. Benthic zones are the bottom surface of the body of water, and what this biome looks like depends on its depth. Near the shoreline, where the water is shallow, the bottom surface is home to a diverse array of organisms because aquatic plants are growing in this area and they provide shelter, a source of food and oxygen. Examples of creatures that might live in the shoreline benthic zone are insects, snails, and crayfish. But when you get into deeper waters where there aren't any consumers or producers, the benthic zone of the lake is mostly populated with decomposers, just like the deeper areas of the ocean. So, as you can see, nutrients tend to be stratified in lakes, just like they do in oceans. There's a lot to eat at the top layer because of the activity of producers, and then at the bottom, you get dead organic matter that settles and supports the decomposers. And when we are introducing marine biomes, we mentioned a phenomenon called upwelling, which is where ocean currents carry nutrients from the bottom layers up to the top. And something similar can happen in lakes called lake turnover. Lake turnover is a seasonal pattern where water will mix at different levels of a lake depending on the time of year and temperature conditions. During the summer, water at the surface of the lake is heated by the sun and therefore becomes warmer than the lower layers. And because warmer water is less dense than colder water, the hot water will remain at the surface, the cool water will remain below, and there won't be any mixing. However, as you get into the fall season, things start to cool off, including the surface of the lake, and the difference in temperature between the top and bottom layers gets smaller. So now water is all the same density, and the different layers will start to mix with each other. This mixing is called turnover, and it serves to circulate nutrients throughout the different layers of the lake. Then, as winter takes hold, the surface layer of the lake may freeze over, and no turnover takes place during this time. But when you get into the spring, that surface ice will melt and start to heat up until it's the same temperature as the water below it. And now again, all layers of the water are similar density, and you get the turnover activity happening. So this is one way that nutrients get circulated throughout a lake. However, some lakes just don't have a lot of nutrients at all. In fact, the nutrient content of lakes varies greatly from lake to lake. And there are actual different terms used to classify lakes based on their nutrient content. This table lays them all out and then tells you some characteristics of each type of lake that arise from its nutrient content, including productivity, clarity of the water, and oxygen level. So the first type of lake listed here is oligotrophic lakes. You can see this in the top left of the table. Oligotrophic lakes are ones that have low nutrients available. Consequently, their productivity, meaning how much metabolic activity is running through the food chain from producers to consumers, is quite low. And without the robust growth of organisms in the lake, such as plankton, the clarity of the water is very high. There is very little cloudiness or murkiness, and you can easily see through the water because there is a minimal amount of microscopic organisms there to make the appearance murky. And there's also high levels of oxygen on oligotrophic lakes because there's not just a lack of producers, there's also a lack of consumers who would be using up the oxygen by performing cellular respiration. And therefore, as oxygen diffuses into the lake, it stays there for a longer period of time from the atmosphere into the water. An example of an oligotrophic lake here in the US is Bear Lake, up on the Utah Idaho border. Here's an aerial image of that lake, and in just a moment I'll show you an image on the ground. But getting back to the table for just a moment, the next category down is mesotrophic, which has medium levels of nutrients, therefore medium productivity, medium clarity of water, medium oxygen levels. And then you get into eutrophic lakes, which have high nutrients, high productivity, but as a result, there is low clarity and low oxygen. So you can see a trend where the higher the nutrient level, the higher the growth of microbes and algae in the lake, the lower the clarity of water, and the lower availability of oxygen. This should sound somewhat familiar to you. We've previously talked about eutrophication as a destructive phenomenon affecting bodies of water that experience excessive fertilizer runoff from agriculture. And in those cases, what we're talking about is a hypereutrophic situation, the last type listed in the table here. In these situations, the nutrient level is very high, so productivity is very high, at least at first. The clarity of the water is very low, and the oxygen level gets rapidly depleted to the point where consumers can no longer survive. Here's an aerial photo of Lake Erie during a hypereutrophic period resulting from excess nutrient runoff back in 2017. So over here you can see the difference in clarity, which gives you an indication of the growth and productivity in the lake. And if we switch to seeing a ground view of these two lakes, the difference is even more apparent. On the left is Lake Erie during an algal bloom, and on the right is the oligotrophic Bear Lake in Utah. At this point, we're going to turn our attention to the other freshwater biome streams and rivers. We'll start by making some general notes of comparison between running freshwater and standing freshwater. Running freshwater biomes generally contain more dissolved oxygen than standing freshwater biomes because most of the water gets exposed to air and streams and rivers. As you can see in this video clip, the churning activity that happens when rivers are cutting their path across the land results in lots of mixing, and so virtually all of the water in the river gets exposed to air intermittently. Running freshwater also contains a continuous supply of nutrients from runoff and from decomposition of dead aquatic organisms or terrestrial organisms that fell in the water. So, the presence of different zones that vary based on nutrition and sunlight is not as prominent in running water as it is in standing water. Within streams and rivers, algae are the main producers supporting the food chain. If the water is slow flowing, they can grow abundantly. Whereas if it is fast flowing, They will be less abundant and will have to adhere to the surfaces in the river, like rocks, in order to remain stationary. Plants can also support the food chain, and they can take several routes to surviving in the winter. They may cling to the rocks, float on the surface of the water, or grow in the sediment at the bottom. The algae and aquatic plants will support the consumers in the food chain, which include insects, snails, clams, crayfish, fish, and amphibians. And just like we talked about the intertidal zone and how organisms need to be adapted to the flowing in and out of water, organisms that live in running fresh water have to be adapted too. Aquatic plants may exhibit long, narrow leaves that minimize resistance to the flowing water, such as the ones you see in this photo. Animals, such as insects, may have hooks or filaments that allow them to anchor to the surfaces and avoid being washed away. Other animals, like fish, have fins and streamlined bodies that are well suited to swimming against the current of the river. And while we're on the topic of rivers, we do need to touch briefly on another zone that is closely intertwined with rivers, and that is riparian zones. Riparian zone is the term used to describe the interface between running freshwater and land. What's considered to be part of the riparian zone is the vegetation growing along the water's edge, as well as the animals that reside at the interface. In this image, you can pretty clearly see what would be considered the riparian zone around the Verde River, which runs through the central part of Arizona, a bit north of us. And riparian zones are very important. They play multiple roles in the river ecosystem. They filter pollution coming from surface runoff before it reaches the river. They keep water clear by trapping sediment runoff. They protect riverbanks from erosion because the roots of plants growing along the river help stabilize the soil. And they provide shade that moderates the temperature of the water and keeps it from getting too hot. Our final aquatic biome is wetlands. Wetlands are areas that are covered in water for at least one season of the year. They are also colloquially called swamps, marshes, or bogs. Because of being waterlogged, the underlying soil contains little oxygen, and plants have to be specially adapted to these conditions where little oxygen is available for their roots to perform cellular respiration. Some examples of wetland plants are duckweed and cattails. And like riparian zones, wetlands also perform important ecosystem functions. They absorb excess water from floods and runoffs. They deplete runoff of excess nutrients before it empties into rivers and lakes, which can prevent eutrophication. They lessen erosion by slowing the speed of water flow, and they provide a habitat for specialized plants and animals that actually need swampy, boggy conditions in order to survive. For example, what you're seeing here in this image is a cranberry bog, and this is actually how cranberries grow. They grow on small shrubs that send out these long runner stems, and they spread throughout the bog, and that is how they survive. So, wetlands aren't just a challenge for living things, some organisms are specially adapted to them and need them to survive. So, on that note, regarding the amazing variety that we see in living organisms and the environments they are adapted to, that's a good place to leave things for this section. We're finished looking at aquatic biomes, and in our next and final section, we are going to take a closer look at the biodiversity of living organisms.